Vodo-Siosk Baas was one of the greatest Jedi Masters of his time, renowned as both a scholar and a fighter. Many of the greatest Jedi of the era were former students of his, though the infamous Exar Kun was also one of his alums. While Baas attempted to limit Kun's studies into the dark side of the Force, Kun ultimately went renegade, delving into ancient Sith tombs and mausoleums in search of artifacts and secrets, re-emerging as a twisted Darksider. The visible face of the new Sith threat was Ulic Qel-Droma, who was captured and put on trial, though Baas knew that the true mastermind was Exar Kun, now Dark Lord of the Sith. Kun burst into Qel-Droma's trial, determined to free his erstwhile apprentice, murdering the Supreme Chancellor in front of the Galactic Senate moments before Baas arrived. Vodo-Baas attempted to talk down his fallen student, but Kun had little patience for his master's words and drew his lightsaber. While the two initially stood evenly matched, Kun quickly seized the advantage when he revealed that he had rebuilt his lightsaber as a saber staff, triggering the extra blade. Incapable of defending against such a weapon, Baas was driven back and cut down. Vodo-Siosk Baas transcended the material plane as a Force spirit, and returned millennia later to aid Luke Skywalker's fledgling Jedi Praxium against Exar Kun's own spiritual resurrection. Darth Plagueis was the apprentice of Darth Tenebrous, and was essentially a product of eugenics, the union between his Force-sensitive parents arranged by Tenebrous to produce him. Darth Plagueis assumed mastery of the Sith Order in 67 BBY, tricking his master into being crushed to death during a mining accident on Baldemnik. Shortly thereafter, Plagueis encountered the powerful Force-sensitive Palpatine, and after manipulating him into murdering his family, took him on as his apprentice, dubbing him Darth Sidious. Over the course of decades, Plagueis and Sidious laid the seeds for the rise of the Empire, planting themselves in the halls of galactic power. However, they nearly succumbed to disaster when various enemies whom they had slighted and undermined banded together and attempted to have them assassinated. Plagueis was severely injured, forced to wear a transpirator on his hideously damaged face, though Sidious viciously retaliated against their would-be killers. Plagueis spent the next 20 years as a recluse, recuperating from his injuries and experimenting on the Force, developing his midichlorian manipulation technique. In 33 BBY, Plagueis returned to the galactic stage and set about ensuring Sidious's election as Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. However, once Sidious's victory was ensured, Sidious killed him, becoming the new Dark Lord of the Sith. Hello YouTube, this is Jen Sarai, the Nerd Rage Ranter, and here is my latest Versus video. The characters are obscure and the matchup was novel, so I was on board. Just to let you know, I am still using fan art for the sections detailing Plagueis' capabilities, but I have scaled it back, and most of the images that I am using have either been retouched or completely redone. With that out of the way, let us begin. According to the Power of the Jedi sourcebook, which unfortunately I don't actually own, Vodo-Siosk Baas was a renowned Jedi weapon master. Also referred to as exotic weapon specialists, weapon masters were high-level combat specialists who trained in esoteric disciplines and the use of alternative weaponry, in Vodo-Baas's case, a simple quarterstaff. Given Baas's track record and reputation as a combat instructor, I think it's safe to say that he was a master of numerous martial arts and fighting styles, and more than likely all of the Jedi lightsaber forms, though this is pure conjecture. When examining Vodo-Baas's role-playing game character sheet in the Jedi Academy Training Manual, there are a number of feats that he is credited with that tell us a great deal about his fighting capabilities. Things like acrobatic recovery, combat reflexes, rapid strike, melee defense, etc. These various feats help paint a more complete picture of what he's capable of. The use of acrobatic recoveries indicates a high level of agility. Combat reflexes indicate his training and physical discipline to the point where he executes his moves purely by instinct. Rapid strike would be exactly what it sounds like and indicates pure, mind-numbing speed. I don't know if melee defense refers to defending against melee weapons or using a melee weapon for defense, but either way, it indicates a powerful defensive technique. Thanks to his centuries of experience, he was adept at off-balancing and staggering opponents with his precise attacks. Suffice it to say, Vodo-Siosk Baas's fighting technique was extremely sophisticated. As the Jedi of his era were regularly confronted by criminals, pirates, and various paramilitary factions, skill in blast deflection and effectiveness against multiple opponents were practically givens. However, for all of his experience, Vodo-Baas was not without his weaknesses. While his character sheet lists dual weapon mastery as part of his skills, that is only because that feat is required for wielding a staff, a two-handed weapon. Baas has no actual training with or against actual dual blades, as shown by Exar Kun's quick victory over him when he applied this method against Baas. While it was possible that Baas might actually have been able to combat dual blade fencing, and Kun's victory was largely due to his own skill with this method, Baas's comments after his defeat suggest that this is a rarely seen tactic, and not one that he was ordinarily confronted by, and therefore not something that he would have trained himself to deal with. However, I think that his apparent weakness against saber staffs bears closer examination. Vodo-Baas was evidently incapable of combating Exar Kun's double-bladed lightsaber, but let's not forget how radically different Kun's design and style are from the standard. The illustrations and panels in Tales of the Jedi that depict Kun wielding his lightsaber show him relying on aggressive flourishing moves, in stark contrast to the pure hack-and-slash swordplay he had demonstrated previously, indicating that he favored speed over strength when wielding the weapon. Add this to Kun's favored tactic of constantly adjusting the blade length and power settings to off-balance and confuse his opponents, and you get something quite unique. By comparison, the standard saber staff was excruciatingly simple, and was wielded in a much more direct and straightforward manner, like a staff. And due to Vodo-Siosk Baas's intimate familiarity with staff weapons, he would likely be able to capably engage a wielder of one of these more conventional weapons, such as Darth Maul, though Exar Kun's lightsaber is another beast entirely. As both of the lightsaber duels that Vodo-Baas is depicted taking part in occur on neutral ground, and were contests of pure skill and weaponry without much opportunity for either combatant to seek the tactical or strategic advantage, this makes Baas's level of strategic and tactical insight very difficult to gauge. But given his reputation for strategic brilliance on the battlefield, I think it's safe to say that had the opportunity to seize the strategic high ground emerged, Baas would have gone for it. When fighting in an offensive manner, Vodo-Baas was blindingly fast and incredibly precise. His defensive fighting method, while somewhat over-specialized, was highly capable. Vodo-Siosk Baas was heavily afflicted by what I've come to refer to as situational specialization. He has quite a broad, diverse, and in some ways obscure skill set, but he trained and practiced to deal with only a very narrow range of scenarios, and whenever confronted by anything outside of that range, he had nothing. That being said, Vodo-Siosk Baas was still a highly experienced master, a true force to be reckoned with. Darth Plagueis' combat and lightsaber skills are difficult to gauge, as he's been involved in only a few fights and he's been depicted in only one serious lightsaber duel against an opposing Force wielder. However, there is enough information presented that I feel confident that I can construct a set of statistics around him. He was proclaimed a master of lightsaber combat by his master, Darth Plagueis. While Plagueis is noted as a dedicated combat enthusiast, meaning his grading would carry a great deal of weight, this is a vague designation, as Plagueis lives in an era of great lightsaber masters. Darth Plagueis' preferred fighting style isn't confirmed in any source, but as shown by his training of Palpatine, his skill set is quite broad and diverse. As indicated by the artwork for the short story, The Tenebrous Way, Plagueis evidently possessed some skill with Jarkai dual-blade fencing, and he was capable of recognizing the Nyman and Terraskazi styles in Darth Maul's fighting style, and is an advocate of Dun Mosh, the Sith tactical method based around psychological warfare. By my own analyses, the evidence strongly suggests that Plagueis' preferred martial art is Nyman, the sixth form of lightsaber combat. As I mentioned previously, Plagueis is a known dual-blade fencer, a fighting method that Nyman provides specialist training in. He repeatedly demonstrated a skill for incorporating force-based attacks into his combat sequences, a core element of Nyman. One of Plagueis' defining attributes as a fighter is his jack-of-all-trades skill set, a method and mentality very much in keeping with Nyman. But more than anything else, Darth Plagueis is a cerebral, scholarly figure who dislikes lightsaber dueling, precisely the sort of individual that Nyman was designed to accommodate. Plagueis is highly adept at bolstering his physical capabilities and fighting style with force-based physical augmentation. His strength is supernatural. When operating at his peak, he is able to disarm opponents with relative ease, as he demonstrated against Darth Venemus, and when fighting unarmed, he's been able to drive his bare fist through humanoid torsos and rib cages. His speed and agility were similarly augmented, to the point where the droid 114D, who is able to dodge blaster fire by calculating the trajectory of the bolts, had difficulty tracking his movements. Plagueis' technique and style is heavily reliant on his physical flexibility and dexterity, most notably in the agile dodges and evasions that are a primary component in his defense, factoring heavily into his ability to combat blaster-wielding assailants. When pressed, Plagueis has the ability to fall into a battle trance of sorts, having an out-of-body experience while essentially working his physical form like a marionette. This battle mind allows Plagueis to push himself far beyond his normal limits, most notably allowing him to defeat Darth Venemus, despite his adversary's major skill advantage. In addition to his skills with the lightsaber, Plagueis is also an expert in various combat disciplines, a result of his broader and more varied Sith training. Plagueis is trained in the use of blasters, vibroblades, explosives, and various other killing tools, both conventional and esoteric. He is an expert at unarmed combat, though much of his effectiveness here is banked on his ability to physically augment himself through the Force. Plagueis obviously is an expert at blast deflection, and extremely effective against multiple opponents and groups, even when fighting at a severe disadvantage, a notable example being the Maladian attack. Harder to gauge than any of his other skills are Darth Plagueis' capabilities as a tactician and strategist. Plagueis has been depicted in several battles, but how one conducts oneself in a battlefield situation versus single combat is going to be drastically different. We've only seen Plagueis participate in one serious lightsaber duel, which means that his typical responses in a lightsaber duel are something of a mystery, perhaps even to Plagueis himself. However, there is a correlation between Plagueis' conduct in his duel with Venemus and the typical conduct of Plagueis' student, Palpatine. Palpatine's typical response when confronted by Force wielders of equal or near equal strength was to engage them in a lightsaber duel, his way of humoring them. But as soon as he is faced with any major difficulties, he immediately resorts to his Force abilities. A perfect description of Plagueis' conduct during his duel with Venemus. While Plagueis did show some tactical ingenuity by manipulating Venemus into overextending himself, this victory was ultimately achieved through the power in the Force. Darth Plagueis is evidently skilled at applying the Force in a tactically advantageous manner, but he is a very straightforward combatant, and when actually fighting, he prefers to best opponents through superior skill and power, rather than cunning or strategic ingenuity, reserving those attributes for manipulation and intimidation on a massive scale. Whether wielding a lightsaber or fighting unarmed, Plagueis is an offensive dervish, combining powerful and fast-paced strikes and sequences with deftly integrated and highly devastating Force-based attacks. When fighting defensively, he relies on a combination of deft blade work and evasive body contortions and footwork. While not a committed warrior, preferring to avoid getting his hands dirty, Darth Plagueis is still a powerful and highly capable martial artist, and is always prepared for combat. Vodo-Siosk Baas's weakness against dual blades and saber staffs, Exar Kun's model at least, proves that he isn't a very adaptable fighter, and that his technique is based more on rote response than anything else. As I've explained before, what this means is that whenever confronted by anything outside of the narrow range of scenarios that he's trained himself to deal with, he's got nothing. Fortunately for Baas, Darth Plagueis really isn't bringing anything too unusual to the table. Plagueis may have a broader overall skill set, having trained and studied in numerous diverse combat techniques and with many different forms of weaponry, from vibroblades to explosives, but his breadth of skill is a disadvantage as well. He's a jack of all trades, a master of none. And then we consider that 90% of those skills would be absolutely useless in a pure lightsaber duel with an opposing Force wielder, and require specialized equipment and tools. What's the use in being a trained sapper if you don't have a bomb? And because he's spread himself so thin, he's not the greatest lightsaber master in the universe. While he is credited as a master of the art, it's a vague designation, and is really just a nice way of saying you're better than most people. And then add this to Plagueis' expressed dislike of lightsaber dueling. Aside from the years he spent serving as Palpatine's combat instructor, he didn't train very fervently, so his skills aren't going to be all that polished. And then we consider Plagueis' negligible combat experience. He's only been involved in one serious confrontation with an opposing Force wielder, and his engagements with regular soldiers and assassins are exceedingly few and far between. While Vodo Baas's confrontations with opposing Force wielders are similarly scarce, he does have the advantage of regular sparring matches with his apprentices, which ensures that his dueling skills remain polished despite his limited practical experience. In addition, his position as the Jedi Watchman of Dantooine, then a rugged frontier world, would have placed him in regular conflict with pirates and criminals who roamed the frontier, providing him with more combat experience than Plagueis. Darth Plagueis' sole advantage as a martial artist is his greater skill at chaining force-based attacks into his combat sequences. His skills with dual-blade fencing do him no good when he only has access to his own lightsaber, and he is at a major disadvantage in every other category. Plagueis' combat effectiveness is more a result of his overwhelming power in the Force rather than his martial skill. He's simply relying on force-based physical augmentation to allow him to overpower and brutalize his foes. His method involves very little technique and very little tactical ingenuity. Vodo-Siosk Baas is a dedicated martial artist, and despite his limitations, I do acknowledge that he is rightly considered one of the Order's best. Darth Plagueis is not nearly so dedicated, and while he is clearly knowledgeable and possessed of a broad skill set, most of his accomplishments as a fighting man have been the result of his overwhelming power in the Force, not martial skill. While this reflects well on his ability as a Force wielder, it does not reflect well on his skill as a martial artist or lightsaber duelist, and for this reason, Vodo-Siosk Baas gets the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist. Vodo-Siosk Baas was an elderly Kravaki male, though he remained physically able despite his advanced age. As a Kravaki, Baas's body was composed of a chitinous exoskeleton with 6 tentacles as limbs. The natural armor covering his body improved his ability to withstand injury, while the 6 tentacles, 2 as his arms, 4 as his legs, allowed him great speed and agility, as well as providing him with advantages when climbing or grappling opponents. According to his character sheet in the Jedi Academy training manual, his strength was 11, which meant that he could lift 110 pounds above his head in a military press, his dexterity was 15, and his constitution was 13, so he was reasonably fast and tough. However, while still extremely fit for a being of his years, Baas was still incredibly old, and was well past his prime. We get a window into how Kravaki age with the character of Saj Calician in the novel Knight Errant. Calician, due to the gradual loss of his free will as a result of strong and continuous telepathic influence, suffered premature aging, and noted the loss of feeling and control in his extremities and feelers. While his faculties could be restored through force-based physical augmentation, when bereft of such enhancement, he was practically an invalid. While Baas's circumstances are markedly different, the loss of sensation and control in his extremities would affect his ability to fight, and the need to fall back on physical augmentation to compensate would negatively affect his stamina. At the time of his death, Darth Plagueis was well over a century old, but he remained in very good health despite his age. As a Mun, he is significantly taller than the average human, with long limbs and a slender frame. Due to his size and proportions, Plagueis had much greater reach and leverage than his nearest human competitors, backed up by great agility and flexibility. His physiology included 3 hearts, which made Plagueis better physically equipped to handle traumatic injury, and with the aid of Sith techniques, he could even continue fighting despite severe injury. Plagueis has suffered some dark side degradation, and displays the yellow eyes and deathly pale complexion common to Sith Lords, though the degree to which his physical capabilities are impaired, if at all, is unknown. However, Plagueis is afflicted by the lingering effects of the severe injuries afflicted to him by the Maladian assassins. He was forced to spend years recuperating, and during that period, his health suffered, a degradation further contributed to by his erratic behavior and habits, due to his obsessive research of midichlorians. Fortunately, his dedication paid off, and he was able to use this knowledge to physically rejuvenate himself, regaining his former physical capabilities. However, he is still forced to wear a transpirator mask implanted into his face to breathe and speak, due to the injuries sustained to his face and neck during the attack. While this breathing apparatus no doubt protected him from poison gas, it is a vulnerable point, and if damaged or disabled, he suffocates. Darth Plagueis' height and physical proportions offer him significantly greater reach, and the resulting leverage his muscles would have on such a large frame would improve his strength as well. Vodo-Siosk Baas' 6 tentacle limbs would offer greater agility and flexibility, as he isn't limited by the humanoid skeletal structure, while the exoskeleton covering his torso and head lends greater durability. On the flip side, Plagueis' 3 hearts, coupled with his knowledge of Sith medical techniques, enables him to better survive and fight through traumatic injury and blood loss. They offer fair counters to one another on almost every level. Plagueis' strength and reach are countered by Baas' agility and flexibility, while Baas' ability to resist injury is countered by Plagueis' better ability to cope with it. Plagueis was able to use his knowledge of midichlorian manipulation to rejuvenate his body, and at the time of his death he was in excellent physical condition, at least beyond his need for the breathing apparatus. The same cannot be said for Vodo-Baas, who is centuries old and well past his prime. Plagueis' only significant weakness is the transpirator mask implanted into his face. Sufficient damage to the device would be fatal. However, considering how much of an advantage Plagueis holds in terms of physical ability, the mask isn't a severe weakness. Darth Plagueis gets the edge in terms of physical capabilities and handicaps. Considering his reputation as a combat specialist, a Jedi weapon master, it follows that Vodo-Siosk Baas would invest much of his power and effort into physical augmentation, though the degree to which he does so beyond his use of force speed is unknown. As a result, much of the following is going to be heavily based on supposition. The big question is whether Vodo-Baas is like Yoda, running nitrous oxide through the engine and just going, or more like Qui-Gon Jinn, only using the Force as needed, but otherwise relying on his native physical capabilities. I suspect that he was more like Dooku, striking a balance between the two extremes, relying on physical augmentation to allow for the performance of otherwise impossible feats of speed and agility, as well as to compensate for his age and deteriorating physique, but relying on technical sophistication to best his adversaries, rather than overwhelming physical ability. Despite his logical focus on physical augmentation to bolster his martial skills, Vodo-Baas still possessed a highly advanced understanding of the Force and a broad skill set, even if the skills saw relatively little use. He was capable of telekinetic manipulation and attacks, even breaking through the Force shields of opposing Force wielders and disarming them. Baas's telepathic abilities were also extremely advanced, and his applications have ranged from long-distance communication to the highly advanced battle meditation, allowing him to bolster the morale of allies while demoralizing the enemy. He has even internalized this ability, boosting his own focus and morale through battle mind. Vodo-Baas's most visible ability was his application of Force Weapon, allowing him to augment his simple wooden quarterstaff with the power of the Force to enable it to parry lightsaber blades. Baas was also familiar with the Sever Force ability, which created a wall of light-side energy around a chosen target, severing the target's connection to the Force, usually just temporarily, but permanently if he so chooses. However, all indications are that this ability is extremely labor-intensive, not the sort of thing that would be of much avail in a combat situation. Plus, we never saw Baas use this ability by himself, instead acting in tandem with Nomi Sunrider and having the blockage further reinforced by the additional power of several other Jedi Knights. Ultimately, Vodo-Baas's greatest power was his ability to transcend the material plane as a Force spirit, surviving his physical death. Overall, Vodo-Siosk Baas was an interesting case. He tends to refrain from more mundane applications of the Force, instead relying on his martial prowess to win the day. When comparing Vodo-Siosk Baas's conduct during his confrontation with Exar Kun to his conduct against Ulic Qel-Droma, the biggest difference is that he relied solely on his martial skills against Kun, but solely on his Force abilities against Qel-Droma. The most obvious reason for this is likely that he was confident that he could subdue Qel-Droma in this manner, but not Kun. If this is the case, then there is a strong likelihood that Baas may refrain from using his Force abilities against Darth Plagueis, reasoning that they would be ineffective against such a powerful opponent. However, the picture starts looking a lot different when one stops and examines the different situations that the confrontations against Qel-Droma and Kun took place in. When Vodo-Baas disabled Ulic Qel-Droma with his Force abilities, incidentally the only time he has ever been depicted doing so, he was in the company of several other Jedi at the time. While there were Jedi present when Baas confronted Kun, none of them were available to offer him aid, so he was on his own. But against Qel-Droma, he was afforded the protection of several individuals who were each perfectly willing to take a bullet for him, and were capable of using their own considerable powers to reinforce Baas, a benefit that he freely exploited. Going by the logic that once is a fluke, twice is a coincidence, thrice is a pattern, I can't draw any solid conclusions from single occurrences of two completely different incidents. But I can hypothesize, and one should remember that only one instance of something taking place does speak volumes, and Baas's confrontation with Qel-Droma is the only time that the character has ever been depicted relying on his combative Force abilities that deal with an adversary. And the fact that he was working in tandem with several other Jedi during this single incident implies that Baas requires time to concentrate and gather his energies before he can utilize his Force abilities, which would necessitate the protection offered by them to ensure that he wasn't attacked and his concentration disrupted. His demonstrated reliance on their reinforcement of his application of Sever Force also suggests that he requires such assistance for the execution of his more powerful and advanced abilities. When confronting Exar Kun, Baas did not have this assistance available to him, and he did not apply his Force abilities at all in this contest. While it is true that he may have refrained because he believed that they would be largely ineffective against someone like Kun, it is also possible that he refrained because he was incapable of using them at all, at least not without assistance. If I'm right, this would place Vodo-Siosk Baas in the same category as Orgus Din, a low-level Force sensitive who compensates for his lackluster ability by devoting himself to his martial arts training. This would also explain why Vodo-Baas's staff broke down so frequently in combat. If his strength is so limited, then he could only continue to augment his staff for so long. However, he may have simply relied on the assistance of the other Jedi because it was available, not because he needed it, and would have made the same decisions against either Sith Lord regardless of whether they were there or not. And the repeated destruction of his staff is instead representative of Exar Kun's overwhelming strength as opposed to any weakness on Baas's part. However, it should be noted that all of the offensive applications of the Force that Baas has been depicted using have been strictly non-lethal, disabling and disarming adversaries rather than actually hurting them. A powerful natural talent created by eugenics Darth Plagueis is beyond a shadow of a doubt an absolute master of the dark side and the Sith arts. Many of Plagueis' abilities were initially the result of his experimentation and applications of his latent power as a child, before his Sith training even began. He was capable of augmenting his physical tolerances and endurance, allowing him to withstand the intense cold of Megiddo snowstorms, and he was a natural talent with telepathy, regularly influencing many of his childhood playmates, even tricking one of them into inadvertently committing suicide. He even learned how to conceal his Force signature from Jedi at an early age, allowing his Force sensitivity to go unnoticed by all save his parents. Considering how potent his abilities were at such a young age, it isn't surprising how powerful he became once he was provided with proper training. His skill with physical augmentation blossomed from enhanced endurance to nigh impossible feats of speed and strength. Beyond the augmented reflexes required for blast deflection, Plagueis is capable of covering ground quickly with Force speed, performing advanced Force-assisted acrobatics. His strength is enhanced to the point where he was able to drive his fists through humanoid torsos and rib cages, even doing so against armored opponents, such as the Maladians during the attack on the Vodo-Siosk Lodge. Plagueis is able to further enhance these skills with a sort of battle mind ability, essentially having an out-of-body experience while puppeting his physical form. In addition to such feats, Plagueis is also capable of using Sith techniques to perform chemical cardioversions on his heart, regulating his pulse and heart rate, and better enabling himself to withstand severe injury and blood loss. Plagueis' combative applications of telekinesis are nothing short of overwhelming, ranging from basic pushes and pulls intended to stagger or disarm, to telekinetic throws to pelt enemies with loose objects, to powerful Force waves capable of terrible destruction. When examining the Vodo-Siosk Lodge after the attack, investigators initially suspected that many of Plagueis' victims had been killed by explosives due to the severity of the damage done to their bodies. In addition to mastering the skills of influence and concealment that he had developed as a child, Plagueis learned how to project powerful Force-based illusions, notably fooling Palpatine with a phantom projection of himself. After much work and experimentation, he even learned how to bypass the natural immunity to Force-based suggestion possessed by the Yinchori. Rather predictably for a Sith Lord, Plagueis is a master in the use of Force lightning. In addition to loosing massive storms of destructive energy, Plagueis is also capable of using it in a more subtle, directed manner. He is able to use it to covertly kill by channeling it into beings that he is in physical contact with, giving the appearance of a seizure. And he is able of using it to short out and disable machinery, though its effects could be nullified or negated by electrical insulators and inert substances, such as Cortosis ore. In addition to these rather conventional dark side abilities, Plagueis is also a capable user of Tutaminis, and is capable of deflecting or absorbing blaster fire with his bare hand, redirecting the energy into a bolt of Force lightning. Plagueis can also use Force Drain to feed off of the life force of those he kills, a technique he taught the Palpatine. As a last resort, he's used the Force to amplify the sound of his voice and use it as a sonic weapon, shattering the eardrums of anyone within 10 meters of him and nearly deafening anyone outside of that. And now we address the elephant in the room, Darth Plagueis' midichlorian manipulation technique. He has experimented with this technique to enhance his skills with mind control, create life through spontaneous generation, and most famously, prolong his own and become immortal. Notably, he used it to rejuvenate his body and fully recover from the injuries he sustained during the Maladian attack, halting his aging and regaining his former physique. Offensively, he has used it to compel the midichlorians in a target to return to their source, essentially willing a subject to die. However, this application seems to be rather labor-intensive and requiring lengthy concentration. not something he'd have time for in a pitched battle. On the whole, Plagueis is an exceedingly powerful combative force wielder, and though his practical abilities are partially affected by his focus on grand manipulations of the Force itself, his attempts to play God, his destructive potential is still immense. Their aptitude with force-based physical augmentation is exceedingly difficult to compare due to the lack of information regarding Baas's usage and applications. However, I think this particular skill is of relatively little importance as it relates almost purely to their martial talents, where I've already drawn my conclusions. Moving on. While Vodo-Baas has applied telekinesis in battle, his demonstrated method has been strictly non-lethal and very low-key, making it clear that he isn't willing to use the Force as a lethal weapon, not even against a murderous Sith Lord. In contrast, Plagueis' combative uses of telekinesis have been awe-inspiring in their magnitude and decidedly lethal. Plagueis' demonstrated variety with telekinesis is also significantly greater than any accomplishments or feats that Baas has been credited with. Force-based telepathy wouldn't be of much use in a confrontation between force wielders trained to resist such influence, which means that mind tricks and battle meditation, among others, are off the table. However, both individuals have demonstrated the ability to direct their powers of mental influence inward to bolster their own focus and improve their combat performance. In this arena, I would again give the edge to Darth Plagueis, as his method, which triggers an out-of-body experience, has a much more profound and tangible effect on his performance than Baas's much more traditional battle mind, which merely boosts his morale and concentration. Vodo-Baas is not credited with any energy-based force abilities, which means that Plagueis gets an automatic advantage due to his mastery of Force Lightning. To make matters worse, Baas has no effective defense against lightning. He doesn't carry a lightsaber, so he can't absorb and redirect the blasts that way, and he isn't credited with any skill with Tutaminis, so he can't defend himself with the Force. Plagueis, on the other hand, actually does have some skill with Tutaminis, using it to absorb the energy of blaster bolts and channel it into a burst of Force Lightning. Moving on. When comparing Sever Force to Midichlorian manipulation, the big thing to consider is the labor intensity of both powers, which means that the chances of either playing a role in this contest are negligible. And that is before we consider the possibility that I outlined earlier, that Vodo-Baas might be incapable of utilizing Sever Force without assistance. And another thing, one of the theories for how Sever Force worked was that it was based around disrupting the midichlorians within the subject, sometimes triggering a mass die-off that lowers the subject's count to the standard level for non-Force sensitives, physically severing the subject's connection to the Force. If this is the case, it is possible that Plagueis could use his powers to protect his own midichlorians from such influence, effectively negating Sever Force. However, this is purely theoretical. But if Plagueis gets the chance to use his powers against Baas, Baas has no defense. While there is some uncertainty due to the lack of information surrounding Vodo-Siosk Baas, at the end of the day, I feel confident giving Darth Plagueis the edge as a Force wielder. Despite his reputation as a Jedi artisan with a talent for fabricating lightsabers, Vodo-Siosk Baas instead chose to wield a simple wooden quarterstaff as his primary weapon. Empowering it through the Force, Baas enabled his simple stick to parry lightsabers, and by channeling Force energy through it, he's been able to shatter large rocks and stones with it, and presumably bones. Aside from the bone shattering, this staff is admittedly a much more passive weapon than the traditional Jedi lightsaber, but it was still quite effective in battle. It offered greater surface area for parrying, and the length increased his effective range. Also, being a staff, the weapon could be used to disable opponents without seriously hurting them, in keeping with Jedi philosophy, unless he uses it to shatter bones. However, this is likely going to be a fight to the death, so let's assume the boss is going to be using this thing to shatter bones. But the staff is not completely flawless. It will eventually cave under repeated lightsaber strikes, though whether this is simply the staff itself breaking or Baas himself weakening from the continuous effort of empowering it hasn't been established. Whatever the case, it does limit the duration of time that Vodo-Baas can continue fighting. Not too much is known about Plagueis' lightsaber. Palpatine notes that it is slightly oversized to accommodate Plagueis' large hands, which makes it very unwieldy for a normal human to use. Presumably, Plagueis' lightsaber would feature a longer blade to keep everything in proportion, given the size of the handle and Plagueis' height. He uses a red-hued synthetic crystal as the focusing lens, in keeping with Sith tradition. Accordingly, his lightsaber would have greater cutting power at the expense of some of its maneuverability, though if Plagueis has trained with this weapon all his life, he would be able to compensate. Vodo-Siosk Baas' staff offers more options in combat due to the variety of possible ways that it can be used. However, due to the presumably lengthened blade of Plagueis' lightsaber, the range advantage of Baas' staff is at least partially negated, and the staff itself will eventually break down under prolonged assault, a weakness that Plagueis' weapon does not share. And of course, lightsabers are more reliably lethal weapons. Darth Plagueis gets the edge in terms of armament. And now, the verdict. Vodo-Siosk Baas may lack adaptability due to his reliance on rote response and his relatively narrow, myopic focuses, and against any other Rule of Two Sith Lord, he would be at a severe disadvantage even in a pure lightsaber duel. As a result of training passed down from masters such as Kasim, Bane, and Zana, individuals descended from the line of the Order of the Sith Lords have long been familiar with the connotations of staff, single blade, or dual blade fencing. The Baneite Sith have more knowledge of the unorthodox than Force wielders of Vodo-Baas' time, a stronger martial arts heritage. Vodo-Baas' bare-bone tactics and skills simply aren't sufficient to combat the duelists of Plagueis' time, despite how unique his method is. Baas does not have enough shock value to throw off the more contemporary and versatile duelists of the Sith Order. However, this wealth of knowledge and training is largely undone by Plagueis' contempt for lightsaber dueling and his overly broad skill set. Plagueis has taken the tenets of his implied lightsaber form, Nyman, very much to heart, and he tries to draw from every pool of knowledge, becoming a jack of all trades, but a master of none. Trying to focus on too much has compromised Plagueis' effectiveness, though Plagueis is very much a victim of his own circumstances, and there is little he could have done to avoid this. Due to his lifestyle, goals, and methods, combat and attack remains a significant possibility at all times, and due to the variety of methods employable by the various assassins, bounty hunters, and contract killers that are sent after him by the people he's pissed off, Plagueis can't afford to specialize. He needs to be as general purpose as possible. However, this jack-of-all-trades approach leaves Plagueis at a disadvantage in a fair contest on neutral ground, because he has spread himself so thin. While Plagueis remains a sturdy and capable fighter, his effectiveness is compromised by his negligent training and his only moderately successful attempt at maintaining such an unrealistically broad skill set. The duel would begin as a pure lightsaber duel, and Vodo-Baas would seize the early advantage. However, as soon as he started gaining any ground, landing any hits, Plagueis would turn to his powerful Force abilities and fight back. Plagueis is a significantly more committed combative Force wielder than Vodo-Baas. While Baas is capable of various telekinetic attacks, all of his observed battlefield applications of the Force have been purely non-lethal. Telekinetic disarmaments and judicious applications of Sever Force to disable his enemies. This implies that Vodo-Baas may be so specialized towards passive abilities intended to harmlessly disable adversaries that he may be incapable of using the Force as a lethal weapon, though this is pure speculation. But the fact that it's pure speculation doesn't change the fact that Plagueis is a much more capable killer, and Baas has no counter to what he's bringing to the table. Whereas Plagueis' broad focus and versatility worked against him as a martial artist, it is very much his advantage in terms of his Force abilities. When viewed next to Darth Plagueis, Vodo-Siosk Baas is, in every sense of the word, an anachronism. His bag of tricks is exhausted. His strength in the Force does not compare. Dooku once described Obi-Wan Kenobi as a
classic of his obsolete kind.
A description that perfectly matches Vodo-Siosk Baas. On the one hand, he is an experienced master who relies on a basic, though unusual style to off-balance his adversaries, but on the other, he is a stagnant master, myopic in his focuses and enslaved to form. While anything can happen in battle, and it is entirely possible that Baas could overwhelm Plagueis before he can resort to his combative Force abilities, chances are Plagueis would be able to fall back on those powers and overwhelm Vodo-Baas. I declare Darth Plagueis the winner. Alright, ladies, gentlemen, and world-destroying monsters from the 5th dimension, remember this is just my opinion, so don't get too bent out of shape because Vodo-Siosk Baas is your favorite Jedi. Special thanks to Matt Chapman of One Last Look Back for his consultation and advice, which ultimately proved invaluable. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. If you have any essay-style comments or major queries, feel free to email me or message me here on YouTube. This is Jin Sarai, the Nerd Rage Ranter, signing off.